All right, so I have a couple questions because you've mentioned some really interesting concepts I want to drill in, and I think probably the class is curious about as well. So one is, let's talk about ed tech companies in particular versus a traditional consumer tech company, right? The generally accepted model of how you scale a consumer company versus how you have to sort of work within and around the framework in the ed tech market. How are the two different pros and cons of the ed tech approach?
Sure. It's a great question. And it's kind of fascinating. Education is one of those few areas that literally every single person in the country has an opinion about. There is a box on every street corner, and all of our children and all of us, most of us went through some kind of schooling at some point in our lives, and people actually have pretty strong opinions about it. So it is one of those areas that has not just a ton of opinions, but a lot of friction about the best way to go about it. And so number one, education is an incredibly local game. It is an incredibly local game. So one of the big mistakes that you see education companies, and Donna talked about the MOOCs, these, as you all know, these massive courses, and others do, is that they start from a perspective of, we kind of call it a crop dusting. So there's, they may send logins to teachers and have kind of a one-size-fits-all, which is really just a replication of the textbook. Something that's printed in in the middle of Wisconsin and shipped to people no matter where they are and where they come from and what their families are like and everything else. And so the challenge for the education space is to really realize very early that Coosa County, Alabama is a very different place than Kearney, Nebraska, and Kearney is a very different place than Houston ISD. And there are different politics, there are different teachers, there's different union dynamics, there's different curricula, there's different standards, and that makes it very difficult to navigate. Some of the states that we operate in have over 1,000 school districts, all with different regulatory standards and testing periods and everything else. So it is a very different ball game than most, and it's highly regulated and is very local.
So two questions on that. One is, what of the venture capital backed model of don't go after the district, go after the parent or the student? Mm-hmm. And what would you say to the question of long sales cycles, long bureaucratic process of getting to a decision within the school district customer?
Yeah, that question alone scares the lights out of me, having sat on the other side of the table from a policy perspective, knowing that when I started the company, I never wanted to be at the West Des Moines School District asking, for $34,000 for one of our licenses, which is really why we created this go get other people over here to pay the entire cost for usage in the district. Now, that's a model that's been replicated a lot in the last couple of years, and I think we had a lot to do with that. There's still, you have a lot of, you have successful companies like Blackboard and others who continue to be very good at just selling to districts and institutions and others. I think it's a pretty tough way to build a scale. There are very few companies that have done that very well. Like, I can count them on one hand. So what you've seen is kind of an East Coast, West Coast. We call it kind of the East Coast versus West Coast philosophy of ed tech. The East Coast are going to be companies like 2U and EverFi and Blackboard, and there's a lot of them that are kind of traditional software companies. We sell something to someone now. Ours is bought by somebody else on behalf of somebody else, but we all sell software licenses. What you've seen out west is, quite logically, is some incredible companies that are making the kind of freemium activation play. So it's the Edmodos and others that are going and getting a lot of usage with the idea that eventually they'll sell stuff across that platform. We have no idea how that's all going to play out. I think it's taken longer than anybody thought it would. And I think the next couple of years we'll see if there are viable models out of that.
Well, and fascinating data if you look at the MOOCs, the percentage of people who start a class versus the percent that actually complete a class.
Sure.
So some.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because nobody knows, like, I think that we have a chip on our shoulder about it. I'll just pretend like we don't, but I think we kind of do. But, you know, it's funny, we're so much bigger than anybody else in terms of usage and completions. Our completion rates are like 85%, and we consider that disappointing most years. But if you look at the MOOCs that get a lot of attention, these are 2 to 3% completion rates of these courses. So it's when it's not mandated and required. So it's pretty low. And so I think they're constantly trying to figure out how to get those up.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk for a minute about, we know selling to and or partnering with school districts can be hard. Selling to and or partnering with corporations can also be hard. Let's talk about the 3 legs of the stool and how you're managing that 3-way relationship and the complexity that comes and how you scale that.
Yeah, it is a very simple but not easy model, and I think it's why I'm mistaken for 65-year-old Pete Carroll most days of the week, is because I look like I'm 107 years old at this point from having to go do it. Well, we've gotten a lot better about it over time, and our customer base is a pretty fascinating one because it is Intel and Neustar, and it's American Express and all of the major financial companies. It's Pharrell Williams and John Calipari, and it's every NHL team, every NBA team, so it's a really interesting group of folks. We have about 1,300 different companies or institutions or so that license our software. It's a very hard thing to do. Whenever anyone comes up and says we're going to do that, I'm like, I want more people to do it because I want people to teach me how to be better at it. It requires a couple different things. One is you really have to align yourself to that. These are companies that care a lot about the communities that they're based in or they have large employee centers in. So you really have to tap into that. These are organizations that have been tied to these schools for a long time. They just haven't necessarily been doing life skills and curriculum sponsorship and donations. They've been doing scoreboards and bake sales and library book buys and giveaways and stuff like that, but not necessarily really hardcore co-curricular instruction. So it takes some time, and what it means is this: you've got to go really high up in the organization, like as high as you can possibly go, usually to the CEO, and you have to get them really excited about something. And what gets them excited is that the scale that education technology can bring to them. There's a lot of impatience sitting in the corner offices of companies and foundations across the company in the very limited size and scope and scale of the programs that they've been operating. So what we hear a lot is, gosh, I mean, we love our relationship with KIPP. We love our relationship with this charter network. We love our relationship with this nonprofit that we've been working with for a long time. What we don't love is that on our best year we reach 67 students or 110 students or something. And so they're going to keep doing that stuff all day long because it is phenomenal, and I want them to. What we also want them to do is start a bit of an air war, which is what technology can allow you to do now. Adaptive pathing, treating students individually, tracking student progress. Those are things you just couldn't do 5 years ago. You couldn't do it 2 years ago. You certainly couldn't do it 15 years ago. So what I'm asking these CEOs of these pretty big organizations say is, like, you guys have got, like, this can't be the next thing that kids in Clarksdale, Mississippi do not get. Like, this can't be the next thing. You can't have education technology and the most innovative stuff that all of you have access to, that I have access to, that my kids have access to down at their private school down the street. Like, this can't be the next digital divide-y thing that leaves 80% of the country sitting on the sidelines. It just can't be. So I think that resonates with them and they get excited about it.
So what criticisms of your model do you get?
Yeah, I think that there's a knee-jerk, I think, reaction to the discomfort of somebody else paying for it. Like, there's going to be some influencing of the curriculum, that there's going to be advertising, neither of which are allowed ever. So those, once we kind of get beyond that, I mean, we've been, have a huge partnership with the largest teachers union in the country. That's, at the end of the day, I care a ton about the students and the parents and the teachers, and the noise around all the rest of, I say to people, I'm like, really, you want to have a conversation about how this gets funded? So what's your answer? I tell people all the time, you're either going to wait for legislatures or Santa Claus, right? So, both of those are probably, they're very hopeful things. They're just not super practical if you're, continuing to push out kids without the skill sets that they're going to need to be successful. And there's just no other way around it other than getting somebody else to pay for it.
So what of the funding landscape, right? When we look at some of these industries, and particularly education, historically not an industry where there's been a massive amount of capital. You shared a pretty compelling story about your first major round. Not an industry where there's been, a unicorn club, so to speak, but an improving capital landscape. I'm curious your thoughts about what's going on in the capital markets around this industry.
So I'm much less concerned about the inflow of capital right now because there's been a lot relative to, it's still a pittance if you think about $500 million in a 5 or 6 month period, or $1 billion. It's actually, when you think about the scope of the problems that we're facing, it's actually kind of a really tiny amount of money relative to I tell people all the time, the kind of provocative line I use all the time is I say, it has taken an incredible amount of money, creativity, thinking, intellect, and others to put, and other things like that, to put kids in low-income communities in the situation that they're in. It's taken hundreds of years to figure that out. So we're not going to figure it out in a couple of great cycles of funding around education technology. It's going to take a long time for us to be able to get resources into the communities that have been left behind. It's going to take a lot of dough to do that. Now, having said that, money's going a lot longer into these companies. You can get a ton more done from an engineering and product perspective than, it's just mind-blowing what you can do right now. And so what's exciting about it is you have an incredible amount of R&D going on in the education technology space. So that may be really expensive venture capital funded R&D. There's an incredible amount of R&D going on adaptive pathing and assessments and other things that that we're watching very closely. What's working out there. I think the challenge is less the input than it is the fact that what we haven't solved in the education space is there's only a few of us that out of like the last couple of cycles who've gotten bigger than 50 or $60 million of revenue a year, and so you wind up with a really small group of $1 million, $2 million, and we all kind of look like, you have a lot of folks that come and say, well, we're in 4 districts, it's working really well, and there's 10 of us, and not dissimilar than from the venture landscape writ large, but we keep looking for those breakout, fast scaling companies, and I'm hopeful that you're going to see a couple of IPOs coming up that I think will be really helpful to the market.
So what are some of the things that you're excited about if you get out your crystal ball and forecast out 3-5 years from now? What are you excited about or hopeful for as far as startups that can really make an impact, the kinds of technologies and innovation?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things that are really cool. When you talk to teachers, which we do, what's kind of neat about EverFi, we're a majority teacher company. So we have 220 some odd people, and a majority of our employees have been teachers. So it's a neat dynamic in that you got people who, rubber hits the road, have been in a classroom. And one of the things that they'll tell you, one of the things that, the 70,000 teachers or however we work with every day will tell you is classroom management and how technology can really be used. So you see companies like Class Dojo and these other companies that are building these really sophisticated tools that allow a teacher to manage a class of 60 or 70 kids in a way he or she has never done it before. By creating reward systems and attendance, like there's been so much data that's shown you that attendance has gone up and disruption has gone down, and kind of light incarceration, which happens through school-based justice, which is really, really uncool, is going down using these applications. That's number one. Number two is this idea of adaptive pathing. So I don't know how, I've been out of school so long, I don't know how much this is into the zeitgeist of what people are talking about in education circles like at Georgetown, but the idea that you would, it's kind of bananas, we talk about it all the time. If you walk into a classroom, we call it the time machine thing. Education is like the only place in the world that you could get in a time machine, go back 130 years and get out, and there's look at this classroom. There's chalkboard, teacher, 50 students sitting there, looking at you. And you could kind of jump to any moment in time, the 60s, the 20s, the 1860s, and go to a classroom and it would pretty much look the same. And heart surgery isn't like that. So I think what's kind of neat is this, so thus this expectation that those beautiful 50, 6-year-olds that walk into that classroom that day, that you would think that they could just kind of dive in all at the same spot at the same time. These kids are hungry, got serious stress going on at home. They've got different, parental situations, like different reading levels, and so what's been neat is technology is beginning to learn to adjust and serve up different pitches, different ways of teaching. We call that adaptive pathing. And that's a really extraordinary thing. If we get that right, gives me chills. If we get that right, the implications of that for really beautiful, super smart kids are it's a big deal. So
it is a big deal. So before we open it up to the group for questions, let's talk a little bit about your development as the CEO.
Yeah.
You talked about the moment of this is either going to go or not go, and you're driving your RV around and credit card's not working. Talk first about the discovery process of how you moved from I'm really passionate about this problem and I'm driving all around the country talking to schools to the iteration of the business that is now scaled and scaling. Yeah. What was that process like, and how did you grow as a CEO through that process? Yeah,
it's a it's a great question, and I don't think about it enough, actually. I've been doing this for just about 7 years, and I think I'm just now beginning to understand a little bit about what I'm doing. But the best thing that I ever did in my development was, I'm not by nature kind of a navel gazer. Literally when I started, you can ask anybody in the company, I would never let whiteboards into our office. And I literally would take them. I took one and threw it out on the street when someone brought one in once, box and all. And because I felt so strongly that the way that we were going to move and learn was if we were just really doing. And that may sound really basic, but I just felt like if we were out in the community, out selling, out in schools, out whatever, and that any meeting, should be 10 minutes or so, 15 minutes. And the way I kind of tried to explain it to people, because we use a lot of cheesy, sports. We're all big sports fans, and so we use them all the time, sayings or whatever. And I would say there's just no game that's ever been won in the locker room. So go into the locker room, do whatever you got to do, give the pep talk, get on the drywall, get on the whiteboard, and then get back, get on the field and learn. And I still feel really strongly about that. It's amazing how I got on some people today about it. I walked in, I opened the door, I was like, why are you guys in it? And I'm actually a really nice CEO, I think. I walked in and I was like, what are you guys meeting in here for? You've been in here for an hour. My God, what possibly could you be talking about? And then the next thing is this concept that, like, I kind of feel like teams, and not many people agree with me on this, by the way, so I'm not sure it's great advice, but like, you should kind of come together as a team once every 3 weeks or something. Like, this concept that you meet every day, like, what have you learned in the last week about this business that is so critical that you sit down for an hour and talk about that? So I think, I think the biggest thing that I have done is I'm a big delegator, and I've continued to delegate. And I've continued to have a philosophy that we've had since the beginning of, I say it all the time, of stabbing people in the heart and praising to the back. And so you walk up and you tell people really tough news, or have them tell you really tough news, and be able to take it and then walk around and make sure to build everybody up when they're not looking. I think that creates an atmosphere, and we've developed as a team where there's no, I really think, if you ask anyone ever, there's just no whispering, there's no behind the scenes little chatter and stuff. And as you get past 200 people or something, that gets harder to do because we're human beings, and it kind of exists at every phase of our life. So, and then the last thing it's had to make me do is, I don't think, it's all kind of, I was joking before, it's all kind of wiffle ball until people start paying you something. And I think the education from really high wattage customers has been the best and the toughest, and the constant, just every day, like when you've got 1,300 some odd really important companies and people you care a lot about. By the way, except for Georgetown, who dropped us this year, you lame people. Hope it's on TV. But Jeff's going to fix that, right? But
all those Georgetown alumni worked for you.
Yeah, didn't help us. We fired all of them the next day. But so that's like, the customer stuff that becomes really real, and so those are big things.
So last question before I open it up. If you were a student sitting in one of these chairs contemplating your idea today, what would you tell yourself?
Oh, what a great question. I would tell myself that, God, what a great question. I think that I would tell myself that to move much faster. And what I mean by that is I would have scaled, I really would have scaled the usage a lot faster. And I think I was so tight and so, and we moved pretty fast, but I think we would have benefited from having a much bigger landscape earlier to learn from. And we were running into really basic, crappy user issues much later than we should have. I think we would have uncovered those with a little larger footprint, and frankly are still uncovering them. But that's probably it. I would have moved to activate a lot more students a lot faster, and we could have done it. So.
I know, I love that advice. So lots of great thoughts today. We're going to close this section, and then we'll open it up for the students to ask their questions.
Great.